I'm William David Sanders Jr. I got stuck with the middle name, and I'm married to my wife Bobby, and we have 9 children. We live in Midtown Tulsa, right across the street from TU. And how many grandchildren do we have? 12 and 2 on the way.
And I'm Susan Sanders McPeters, and David and I are 10 months apart, and I live in South Tulsa. I'm married to Scott McPeters. We have 8 children and 13 grandchildren. I'm a neonatal intensive care nurse. I work at St. John.
I'm Sarah Sanders Bright, and I live in Jinx, Oklahoma, and I have 5 children and lots of grandchildren. I can't count them. And just feel blessed to be part of this family.
I'm Shirley Sanders Stairs, and I am married to Michael Stairs. We were camp directors at Shepherd's Fold Ranch for 20 years, which his parents started the camp. And I live here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We have 7 children and 7 grandchildren, with number 8 on the way.
I'm Danny Sanders, or Daniel Sanders, when I'm in trouble anyway. Daniel Edward Sanders when I'm really in trouble. Yeah, I feel really blessed to be in this family too. I'm married to Tammy, almost said Tammy Thomas, Tammy Sanders. We have 2 incredible daughters that are huge blessings and miracles. And we live in Jinx, America. So we're all pretty close. I think it's fun to have all of us and most of our families living at least pretty nearby in the region. So Thanksgivings are a blast.
Well, we are typical Americans. Heinz 57. We know that we have Cherokee blood from my father's side, and my great-great-great-grandmother walked the Trail of Tears. Should have brought a picture of her, but one of my dad's earliest memories was sitting on his grandmother's lap, and she had a Cherokee Bible. On my mother's side, they're pretty much German stock, Luther marks, and you know, but like I said, Heinz 57, German, Irish, and Scottish. Keep going.
That's all Kim told me.
Yeah, yeah.
Cousin Kim.
It's but we are, you know, there's preachers throughout our family on both sides, and it is really amazing the godly heritage in our family.
But if anyone knew my dad, he took great pride in his Indian heritage. He had the full headdress and stuff, and it was always fun, you know, seeing him bring that part out. So.
Our son Jordan had an Indian birthday party. Back then we called it Indian. And my dad and his brother, our Uncle Ed, came to his birthday party, and they were so hilarious. They made the party because they acted like they were speaking Cherokee. My dad had Parkinson's, and so it was hard for him to really get words out, but he acted like he was speaking Cherokee by just doing hey yeah hey yeah yeah. And then my Uncle Ed would interpret what he just said, so he had full reign to say whatever he wanted to say. And then so my uncle asked for a volunteer to get a secret message in Cherokee, and he said the words were Owa and Tegu and Siam, and if you start saying them very quickly, then you would get a secret message. And so he got a volunteer, and actually a friend of mine who was there with her son, who was Jordan's good friend, volunteered, oh, I want to do this, I want to do this. And he said, well, you have to get on your knees and you have to start doing this. And you just start saying faster and faster. Owa, Tegu, Siam. Owa, Tegu, Siam. Owa, Tegu. Okay, faster, faster. Until you're saying, oh, what a goose I am.
It was really, I mean, I was very little, so they're going to have a lot better stories than I do. But in hindsight, looking back, one of the things that has really hit me as I've been thinking about this interview is what a trooper Mom had to have been, because she had 5 kids in this house, and then she had hippies, you know, coming in and sleeping on the floor, and still had to maintain normal life, you know, a relatively, hopefully, normal life. But one of the things that really stands out to me, and if I could say something about Dad during this time frame, is the heart that he had for people and the heart that he had for youth. Just as I was thinking about a man that was a pastor of a Southern Baptist church going out and reaching out to these hippies that were doing drugs on the cars, cruising up and down the Restless Ribbon, which is Peoria, and back then it was the big cruising spot, and they saw something in him, even in their state, that conveyed, this guy cares about me, this guy loves me, and he's got something that I want. And the reason I bring that up is because all of us growing up with Dad saw that, I mean, then, yes, but all through his life. You could barely stop at a gas station without him sharing Jesus with somebody.
Do you know my Jesus?
Yeah.
Just natural as could be. He had a real heart for people. The word that keeps coming to me is genuine.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
It's true. When I tell people that my dad was a pastor, I say, but he was one that practiced what he preached. Because, you know, a lot of people had this idea about pastors of, well, they might be good speakers, or they might be good, you know, people. But he really practiced what he preached, and we got to see the real him. Well, everybody else did too, because he practiced what he preached.
He took me to Brookside with him one time on a Friday night to talk to the hippies down on Brookside, and I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and he just told me to hold his hand, and he had a coffee house made out of a bus. He had some men in the church help him make that little coffee house on wheels, and I just remember him saying, do you know Jesus loves you? So the thing I took with me from that is I loved that he didn't preach at people. He just asked them the simple question, do you know Jesus loves you? And it was so gentle and genuine, and I think he would invite them in on this bus and give them hot chocolate or coffee, and just start talking to them about how much Jesus loves them. So that was precious to me.
Yeah, that's true. I was walking with him down on Peoria one time, and this was much later. This was, I don't know, in the 80s probably. And we were just walking down there. He didn't, I think of that song, I'll become even more undignified than this. He didn't care so much about his dignity, but he wanted to share laughter, he wanted to share fun, and he wanted to share Jesus. And you know, some of us were, like Shirley mentioned earlier, involved at Shepherd's Fold with a camp. You know, one of the things that you take away from a situation like that is you can love Jesus and you can still have fun. And people see it and they're drawn to it. And that was Dad. Dad loved to have fun. And we were walking down there. He stopped, he saw this, this establishment had big glass windows, and people were in there drinking and dancing and stuff like that. And he just stopped and started making faces, you know, and getting their attention. And nobody came out that time, but if they had, I can guarantee you, he would have shared Jesus with them, because he just used his talents, his personality. I mean, he was an athlete. Anything that had a ball, he was good at, even golf. He'd play golf once a year, you know, and shoot better than most people that played once a week, because he just was gifted. And horseshoes, he was competitive at everything, you know. Pickup sticks. The guy he had Parkinson's, and he would beat you at pickup sticks. So it just wasn't fair.
So we hit the pickup sticks.
Yeah, we didn't like that game.
He blamed me for that, was you?
Do what?
I remember when I was a little girl, and he played church baseball league, and he was pitching slow pitch, and he would make those balls just arch like this way high and then come right over the plate. And I just remember this one time someone hit a pop-up straight to him, and he's like this, just going like this, and then he goes and catches it behind his back.
He did that a few times.
Yeah. Oh yeah, more than once.
You know,
Maybe a little bit of a show-off.
well, one of the things that Tammy reminded me about was one of the last things that he said, and you were there too, he said to us before he passed was, I just don't feel like enough people are telling other people about Jesus. So it kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier. It's like his life story had to do with drawing other people to Jesus, encouraging other people to get to know his Jesus and the love of Jesus. And for him to, one of his last very strong impressions that he left on us was, you've got to be sharing about Jesus. So it was such a challenge. And that's that same thing that I think the kids down on Riverside saw the genuineness, of the authenticity of his relationship with Jesus, and that there was something different. And yet I think they saw the realness, and that you could have fun and you could still love Jesus, you know? So I always felt like, I'll be honest with you, I don't say this in a proud way, but I almost felt like I had a leg up on a lot of other people, because he was such a good reflection of Jesus, of a father that loves you, you know? So I just felt like I had a little bit of a leg up, because I had a better view than maybe a lot of people did about the way Jesus loves us, you know?
Well, I think one thing that stood out to me growing up was not only the one-way bus, because I did go down with them many times on Peoria and froze my hind end off too, because there were some many cold nights, but kids were drawn to the bus to get hot chocolate or get coffee. But, you know, we grow up in an era of march for this, march for that. One thing that stands out in my mind is when we had a march for Jesus, and we all went down on Peoria, and we basically praised Jesus and marched for Jesus. And that was one thing that really stood out in my mind, so.
I kept Dad in check.
Dad couldn't get the big head because
I I actually, during a Wednesday night in Fellowship Hall, a friend who I'd invited to church, we decided to go climb the rafters over Fellowship Hall. And there was a false ceiling right below, and I slipped. I'm glad I didn't fall all the way down, but last thing I remember is, I believe it was Gail Runnels looking up just as one of those tiles hit him. And my mother couldn't see my face, but she knew it was me because I was wearing orange socks. And when they met me at the other end, of course, the kid that I brought to church with me ran home. And I remember my dad saying, should I take him across the alley to the church office or should I take him home? And she said, take him home, they'll hear him there. So I knew I was in for it.
Sounds really bad.
Do you guys remember any of the responses or any of the feelings as these hippies, the long-haired hippies were coming into the church? Do you remember any?
I remember them sitting on the front row.
Really?
Front row, second row, third row, and listening intently. And it was really a startling thing, you know. And it's funny, years later, attending a Baptist church, there were actually, when Bobby and I first started attending that church, there were people there that remembered Dad.
Oh, yeah.
And fond memories, you know, and the work he did. So
That's cool.
yeah.
You know, that's something that I run into as well. I remember running into a lady where I worked at the time, and she found out who I was and who my dad was, and she goes, oh, I loved Brother Bill. I still consider him my pastor. Mm-hmm. And you know what? He gave me some advice, and I didn't follow it, but he was right. But I run into person after person that knows who Dad was or had gone to TCF at some time or another, and they say, the common thing they say is, I still consider him my pastor. And this is years after they've been going to a different church. He had a shepherd's heart. He had a pastor's heart, and he loved people. And again, whether you were a hippie on Brookside, you know, cruising up and down Peoria, or you were somebody with a family, or you were getting marital counseling by he and mom, you know, they just were drawn to the Lord through him and through that love that he had for people.
One woman I ran into when I was visiting at a hospital, and she said, Shirley Sanders. She saw me in the elevator, and she said, your dad was the best shepherd I ever had.
Yeah. Yeah. He did a lot of marital counseling, and he would be up front with them and tell them, hey, I really don't think you should do this. Like one of the ladies I talked to, she said that's what, and she went ahead and did it anyway. And unfortunately it didn't work out, but yeah. Okay, and here's another story. One of those hippies that came to church, this is when we were meeting at Edison at the time, was talking to somebody in front of the church, one of the people that went to Tulsa Christian Fellowship. And I guess he was trying to kind of lead that person astray. And I think we all remember this because Dad stopped the car and he started going, wolf, 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 as if to say, there's a wolf after the sheep. And you know what's interesting to me, if it's the right person I'm thinking of, that guy stuck around and he became quite an evangelist,
Changed
really.
his life.
Jesus in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Well, any advice Dad gave you was biblically based,
yeah.
you know, and so it was going to be good advice based on God and His ways, based on His Word. I remember one time I borrowed a suit to go to my wife's sister's wedding, and I didn't have a suit, but I borrowed one of his, and the suit looked brand new. And this was the kind of man my dad was. He let me borrow it, and I said, "Dad, this suit looks new, but the knees are a little worn." And he said, "Well, that's the suit I wore when I prayed for you a lot." And, you know, and that was his kind of humor too. That really was a statement. But for me, I was a paper boy when I was in junior high, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, even into 10th grade. And I would get up at 4 in the morning, and a lot of times he would already be up, and I'd see him in one of two positions, either sitting on the couch reading the Bible or kneeling and praying. And I mean, he spent time with the Lord.
And he wasn't shaken by having a child get up early and interrupt his time with the Lord. He would feel me peeking in that little slice of light coming through over the top of the door, going into the den where his office was. And I'd be peeking in there, and he'd say, "Come on in, Shirley girlie." And he'd just let me sit on his lap as he finished praying. And yeah, just precious times that I remember with my dad. Mm-hmm.
As far as young people crashing on our living room floor and things like that, I think we were all still kind of young, or we just kind of went with the flow. You know, I can't speak for my mom and how some of that might have, you know, affected her. You know, certainly she was a mother who wanted to protect her children, but I think the whole family just kind of went with the flow of people being there, just like a slumber party, you know. And you know, one thing led to another. You know, thus the Jesus Inn was born, and probably Gordon can give a lot more insight to some of that thought process and what was going on. But yeah, he had a heart for kids. Sometimes they ended up here, and then eventually, you know, the church figured out something for these kids that needed, you know, further help and encouragement. So.
Well, I think my mom put an end to them coming and sleeping on our floor, and they slept on the floor of the fellowship hall, and that did not go over well with the church, the people in the church. I can see, when I was watching the Jesus Revolution movie, I could see that same response of the church people, because those kids smelled like alcohol, they smelled like smoke, they're sitting in my spot. And that is one of the reasons our dad was fired from Brookside Baptist, because those hippies were coming in and it was offending the religious. And so they kicked them out from being able to sleep in the fellowship hall as well. Now, when Mike's mom and dad started Shepherd's Fold in 1972, there were hippies that were living, at the time it was called the Big G Ranch, and there were hippies living there at the ranch, and a few of those hippies were actually some of the same kids who started, who were kind of helped start Jesus Inn, that is a part of the fellowship at Tulsa Christian Fellowship. They were under the covering of Tulsa Christian Fellowship.
And there were high school kids. Remember when there was that on 41st Street. What was the name of that? Do you know?
Jacob's Well?
Yeah.
And the youth group would join in and help, like serve sandwiches and do stuff like that. And they would have people come in at Jacob's Well and sing and share Jesus, you know, place for the kids to get off the street.
So Mom was the harvest queen at OBU, right?
Mom was beautiful, as the pictures will attest to. She was the harvest queen at Oklahoma Baptist University, and Dad was the Oklahoma BSU president while he was a student at Tulsa University. And I don't remember exactly how they met, which time, but
I thought it was
was
a
a-
retreat.
At Glorietta.
Glorietta.
They went on, she lives in Edmond, but went to school in Shawnee, Oklahoma, and OBU, was real active with the BSU, the Baptist Student Union there, and then Dad was real active with the Baptist Student Union at TU, and then he ended up being the state BSU president. And so all the Oklahoma group went on a trip to Glorietta, and that's where they kind of
They met, and then Dad ended up starting to make a lot of trips to Edmond, Oklahoma. And he was smart. He won the mama's heart. He sold pots and pans and kitchen type trinkets on the side that helped make ends meet. And he'd always take my mother's mother a gift.
So sly.
But do you remember that our mother wanted nothing to do with Dad at the very beginning when she met him on this retreat? Because she said a friend of his said that he wanted to be introduced to her, and she thought he was a show-up and would have nothing to do with it.
well, and she was called to be a pastor's wife.
Yes.
And at that time, I don't think that he had shared that part of his life, that God was leading him into ministry. So,
I mean, he played baseball on scholarship for TU, right?
And he was a good athlete.
As a matter of fact, his plans were to be a professional baseball player. He played in some of those, maybe the equivalent of a AAA league in the summers, and where they traveled around a bit and things like that. And then God called him to be a minister, called him to be a pastor. He answered the call. Maybe that's why he loves church softball so much. Huh?
Was it that, or was it that he found out Mom wanted to marry a pastor?
Oh,
God works in mysterious ways.
that's right.
yeah, that was a real exciting time in TCF's growth history. We had this ministry going on in the Restless Ribbon. People were coming in and out of the church. I think Dad also had connections with Anaheim, and some of the pastors out there in California that were experiencing tremendous growth. And there was Catherine Kuhlman and that ministry in Tulsa. And we had Corey Ten Boom, who came out. Yeah, there was, a lot of the guys that were involved in.
Arthur Blessett.
Richard Warren.
We could do a lot of name dropping, so, but
Even,
it was.
even Keith Green came,
Yes,
came while we were
yes.
at Edison.
But Corey Ten Boom coming to our home and having lunch with us.
In this home,
Yes.
was
Corey Ten Boom coming and staying in our home or having lunch with us on a Sunday afternoon after she had spoken at church was my favorite of all, because she sat in our living room, and I just remember sitting at her feet just wanting to ask one question after another. And my dad collected pocket watches, and she was a watchmaker because she worked in her father's shop in Holland. And so when I was in ninth grade, she came back through, and she would take a nap every afternoon because she was, pretty elderly at that time. And I had been doing a report on the hiding place for a written and oral report in ninth grade. And so my book was back there on the desk in the room where she was going to take a nap. And her assistant, Ellen DeCroon, at the time, I think went back there and saw that and had her sign my book for me. Tonti Corey. Yeah.
Maria von Trapp was another one. So that was exciting for us as well. I think one of the album there had a picture of Corey there, and also with Maria von Trapp. So the real Maria von Trapp. So.
I was just a little guy when Corrie ten Boom was here, and one of the things I remember about her was the peace that surrounded her. It was amazing, really. And then when you think about what she went through, man, the Lord had allowed her to cultivate that, I guess, that peacefulness. But the thing that stood out to me is, it's not like I walked around picking up things about people, but when I was in her presence, I was like, wow, there's such a peace about her.
Such a love. Such a love of God. I remember going through a little bit of a rebellion when I met her. And I don't know what I expected, like, you wicked woman or whatever. But all I felt was Christ's love, just.
Yeah.
Well,
It exuded from her.
It did. And she talked all the time about forgiveness. And actually had opportunity in her lifetime where she met one of the main guards at the concentration camp where she and her sister were held, and her sister died in that concentration camp. But she was able to actually tell him that she forgave him. Yeah. After going through that, how many people would be able to forgive that kind of cruelty?
So when I was about 10 years old, our first mother died of cancer, and that was pretty tough, I think, for all of us to swallow, but even the folks in the church, because here you've got this pastor that's full of faith, and yet his wife passed away from cancer, didn't get healed. So that was like a punch in the gut. And yet, Dad again was able to bounce back. And on the other side of that, I mean, I think it deterred some people and hurt some people, but other people you really felt the love from, and you would grow through those tough times like we all experience. And what was it, about a little over a year later, actually the lady that came in and repainted and redecorated, or helped redecorate Mom's room when she was going through all this cancer stuff, was a single lady. And I don't know, one of you guys might know the story better about.
I know a little. I like to think I brought them together. I remember teasing Dad after Mom died. I said, because he was a tease, we felt he was fair game, believe me. And so I said, Dad, the lady that decorated Mom's room she's been asking about you a lot. She really seems interested. And he goes, really? And I said, no, I just want to see how you react. But Anne was such a blessing. I mean, we missed her mom, and it was hard. I think we all believed that she was going to be healed, you know. So, but Anne came in and was just a trooper and got us all married off within 3 years, except for you, Dean boy. But such a blessing.
She really adopted us, and
She did.
all the grandkids that were already born or were being born while she was still alive, she just treated them like they were her own. So I don't think you could have asked for a better mom to come in. And two, I'll say this, because I was at home probably the longest, well, definitely the longest after Dad and Ann got married, was they were like on a honeymoon the whole time. I mean, you'd have thought they'd have been married that same year, every year of their marriage. They just so enjoyed each other's company. And I think they were really looking forward to enjoying it more after I would get married and leave the house. Yeah, he started out my wedding, he started out our wedding, I should say, with finally brethren. The last of 5 kids is getting married. So.
And he can clean out our attic, get rid of his stuff. Well, the word I would use to describe Anne is gracious. She was the most gracious person, and she just allowed me to follow her around the kitchen. I just remember following her around the kitchen because she would just like be able to put a meal together like that, and always had enough in case someone stopped by. And I'd follow her around and ask her questions, and I'd just be leaning on the cabinet like this, and she just turned around and started laughing at me because I was talking so much. And she was so patient. She just had so much patience to listen and to answer. But one of the things about her that I appreciated most was that she grounded me with a different perspective. It was like bringing me down to earth if I ever wanted to kind of over spiritualize something. And it was usually with a question, well, honey, have you ever thought about this? And I thought, no, I haven't. And it was kind of the first time in my life that shook me out of just believing something because that's how I perceived my parents wanting me to believe, or how I thought I was supposed to believe as a Christian, because I always wanted to do what was right. So it kind of jostled me, I guess you would say, and made me really think for myself what I believe.
Well, I always thought that Dad didn't wait long enough to get married again. But he was madly in love with Anne, and she was, gracious is the perfect word. Mm-hmm. And so I was, you know, unlike Danny, I had my mom for 21 years, and I was grown and away at school. And I was determined that no one else would be my mom. My mom was gone now to be with the Lord. And so when I was 21, my mother died. 22, Dad married Ann. I think I was 23 or 24, and one day I went running out the back door, and she said, "See you later." And I said, "See you later, Mom." And as I was going out the door, I thought, what? You know? And but that's just what kind of person she could step right in and be your mom. Mm-hmm. And like Danny said, it was kind of sickening, really. It was like they were on a honeymoon all the time, you know. I was working in the middle of the night at Wonder Bread, and I came in about 2:33 in the morning, parked my car in the back, and was coming across the yard, and I thought I heard some giggling. And they weren't married yet, but they were laying on the trampoline in the backyard underneath a blanket. And I came inside and flipped on the floodlights. And I went back out and I said, that curfew works for everybody. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think they must have reverted, back to teenage.
Yeah.
Well, I remember when they first got married, I remember Anne looking at me and saying, and it kind of makes me tear up sometimes, and this is how gracious she was, but she just said, I just want you to know that there is no one like your mother, and there will never be anyone to take her place. I'm not here to try to take your mother's place. I'm just here to support you in whatever way I can. So, beautiful, gracious person.
Anna Lou from Eldon, Mizzou. She was a farm girl, and she could make biscuits and gravy. Man, it was good. She was kind of a, I don't know, what do you call that when she was a gourmet farm cook, but she was also a health food nut. So you had two sides. There's quite the dichotomy, right? You had two sides, because on the one side, you'd be eating these cookies that were made with honey and oats and carob chips or raisins, and in the Easter eggs, she would put raisins and stuff like that. So all the kids would be like, oh boy, raisins. But then on the other hand, for breakfast, she'd make you this incredible biscuits and gravy and good old farm cooking. So when Tammy and I got married in the summer of '94, and helped out a lot with the wedding, she was, again, very gracious. And then when we were on our honeymoon, they called. No, we called them, my bad. We called them, and I hung up the phone, and I just kind of had a knowing.
She said, I don't feel well.
Yeah, she said, I don't feel well. And I kind of had a knowing that she had cancer for some reason. And when we got back from our honeymoon, we never saw her fully dressed and out of the house again. And she passed away that same year. So November of '94. And then after Ann died, Dad, it was not good for man to be alone, right? And Dad was definitely fit that that aspect of Adam. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, just before we take off from Anne, Anne actually had, she had a degree in decorating, interior decorating, but she also went back to school to be a nurse to take care of our dad.
Since he had Parkinson's.
Since he had Parkinson's,
I think
yeah.
she had her pinning in December of '93. Our three youngest boys out of our 7 children were born in this home. And so I wanted her to get to be part of that delivery, if that was okay with the midwife. So she helped deliver our Sullivan, and then she found out she had cancer pretty soon within '94, and she passed away, like Danny said, in November.
She didn't reveal until after our wedding.
Right.
She's one
Yeah.
And we did come and
Oh, yeah, so there's another story about Anne, when she found out she had cancer, and my dad said she didn't want to do chemotherapy. And he said, would you please try something? He didn't want to lose another wife. And she said, well, she said, Bill Sanders, you are not my first love. And she was looking forward to seeing Jesus. She had that desire in her to see Jesus. And I said something to her. I said, don't you just hate cancer? I hate cancer. And she said, well, honey, there's got to be something that takes you out of this life. And I thought, that changes my whole perspective on what it is to live in a broken world. It's not perfect. And there is going to be something that takes us out of this life. And it wasn't because she didn't believe in healing. I know she did. And I do too. But God is, He's supreme, you know, and He's all-knowing. And He is the one that has the full picture.
The way I heard the story, or the way I know the story, is Dad wanted her to try chemo, radiation, and she says, no, Bill. If I'm healed, I get to stay here with you. And if I go on, I get to be with Jesus. So,
Win-win.
yeah.
Well, and I think another thing about it, as you guys talk, I remember some stuff. That was such a spiritual growth time for Ann. The time that she and Dad were together, it's like she was so hungry for the Lord. And Dad had so much to share with her that it was like, what do you call that, a symbiotic relationship of sorts, where she just was growing and she was hungry. You could see it on her. And she grew so much with the Lord and wasn't afraid to go.
Just after she went to be with Jesus, we would all come around and visit Dad. And I think we all had this experience where he would look out the front window and it would just break your heart, you know, because he had such faith, such faith.
That's true.
It's good.
You could remember, I even remember him crying. You could hear him cry in his room, you know, after both moms died. Now that was one of his main scriptures was, my grace is sufficient for you.
Dad and I were fishing, and at that time, literally had strapped him in the boat with a belt so he wouldn't tend to fall over. And so he's in the front of the boat, and Dad, you know, in the early years always liked to work the motor. Well,
yeah.
You have to work the motor now, the little electric motor, fishing on Spring Creek. So one day I was pretty down and a little despondent, and so I thought I'd take someone down with me. And I asked Dad, I said, Dad, aren't you a little bit bitter sometimes? Aren't you just a little bit bitter? Of course, he had Parkinson's, and he kind of shifted like this and looked at me and went like that, you know? And I said, you've lost 2 precious wives to cancer. You have Parkinson's, you love sports. It's affected your voice and your ministry. Aren't you just a little bit bitter sometimes? And he was quiet for a little bit. And then he did the old scoot around again, and he got up his voice. And you remember those days. And he said, His grace is sufficient for me. I could have slid off in the water, you know. I just was corrected, rebuked, and inspired at the same time. They got married in March of '98, and my dad and I were out shooting baskets right over there one day, and he said, we were talking, he was talking about, you know, should I date or anything, and I said, what about that Gloria gal, you know? And they had known each other for years, and I remember going to Spring Creek as a teenager when her first husband, Fred, was alive. His dad loved to fish. And long story, you know, they had their ups and their downs in their dating relationship. They were both older. When they actually got married, Dad was 65 and Gloria was 70. But I think it was just some common background and knowing each other for years. They had a unique relationship, but it was good.
Well, from Brookside, wasn't it? Their roots went back to Brookside. And yeah, I remember going fishing with Dad at Spring Creek and meeting Fred and Gloria. And so it had been a friendship that it evolved over years, and they liked doing a lot of the same things. So, and I actually was on my 40th birthday fishing trip, and Gloria and Uncle Ed and Dad and I went on that, and that's where it became a little bit of a profession of love. So that it eventually evolved into them getting married a year later. So.
And Gloria was,
That's what I tell people is he finally married somebody that outlived him. So, but we all loved her. And to your all's point, the relationship was different. It was more of a friendship and companionship, and they both loved a lot of the same things, but it was fun to watch.
They could both be ornery too.
Oh yeah.
but Gloria had such a great dry humor. She was very, very witty and so funny with her wit. And but I tell you what, that woman was strong and clever.
Smart.
Very smart. Like one time my dad fell and she couldn't get a hold. I remember, I think Mike and I lived away at the time that she had tried to get a hold of you or Danny or someone. She couldn't get a hold of anyone, and she couldn't get him up by herself until she thought to go get a belt. So she slipped a belt around him and put her foot on the sofa, which was backed up against the wall, and was able to lift him. And yeah.
She had a degree in engineering too, just to tell you, which was kind of not something you saw a lot in women from that era. So
Yeah.
she just recently died in February. So
Never thought I'd see a cat in my dad's house till he married Gloria.
She loved pets.
What he told us.
And they all had the middle name June.
Yeah.
Did she call him Billy June?
No.
No? Oh, okay.
I had this Bible. Dad had it at Fern Creek Baptist. Him and Mom had matching Bibles like this. They're just little Revised Standard Bibles. And going through this one day, I saw this. It says, "None of self and all of thee," January 12, 1966. I can only surmise that's something personal with my dad. But he was still in Fern Creek at the time. And I looked up the date, and it was on a Wednesday in 1966. You weren't around yet.
Nope.
And, you know, I think maybe, you know, that wholehearted recommitment to the Lord, maybe in my heart, it seems like, it's speculation, something was set in motion that he wound up here in Tulsa in the ministry. And I think it's cool that he wrote that in there anyway. You know, none of self and all of thee, January 12, 1966. So that's the kind of man he was.
He wouldn't want to be on a pedestal, you know? He wouldn't.
She's saying
That's,
what?
God was everything to him. Jesus was everything to him.
A lot of people would point to Bill Sanders, you know, charismatic, dynamic leader, and he would point up to the Lord. Actually, it was a name they chose just as an interim name, because most of the people that went there were Baptist. And what they were, how TCF really started, from my remembrance, was there were people who wanted to continue the ministry on Peoria, on the Restless Ribbon. So they started meeting, and they called Dad as pastor. And that's really how it started.
They were meeting for several months, as I understand it, and they all asked him to be their pastor. And they are the ones, the people who had left Brookside Baptist, who were not in favor of him being fired.
Yeah, the church split.
Yeah.
Well, there were people from other churches that wanted in on this ministry too. And that's really how TCF grew. It was around the ministry on originally the Restless Ribbon. And they thought of all kinds of names, something Baptist this or something Baptist that. And, well, for now, let's just call it Tulsa Christian Fellowship. And it stuck. You know, one of the things that I noticed was the different style of worship. You know, you had your traditional bulletin and 2 or 3 hymns, some announcements, and then a message, and then a invitation call, and during another hymn like "Just as I Am" or "Softly and Tenderly Jesus is Calling." And TCF developed into a whole new kind of worship, or of what we would even call nowadays contemporary praise music, and there would be times of worshiping in the Spirit corporately. Do you all remember that?
Mm-hmm.
And it was just it was an eye-opening time.
And people being healed too.
Yes.
You know, the little Redmond boy that fell, and
Oh, yeah.
you were pretty young.
I remember the Redmond.
I think that's why that Jesus Revolution film resonated so closely to what we experienced. You know, you come from the traditional Baptist church with the organ and the piano and, you know, your little organized way of doing worship to jeans, guitars, and, you know, hippies, so to speak, and a different group of people and the way they dressed when they came to church to worship on Sunday. So,
And yet, I can remember growing up having kind of the best of both, because you'd still get some hymns as the Lord led, you know, they would break out in hymns, but then they would do the worship songs too, like you were talking about. So it was really a fun mix.
Y'all remember that where he fell off the wall, and we were meeting, and the parents just brought him, were holding him like that, and everybody stopped and interceded, and there was such faith, and it's been like that, pockets of times like that all throughout, but that was the one that stuck out to me. And he started breathing, you know, he started breathing, and they didn't know how he would be, and he was completely normal. So God is good. God is good, and I thank the Lord first, foremost, that He did give us parents that we had, our mom and dad, and our other mom, but it's just God's grace, you know, in our lives, and the faith that has happened, miracles that have happened with Susan's son. You know, that was what, a couple years ago. They didn't even, last year, they didn't think he was going to make it, but he did. They gave him a 20% chance. And it's just a body of believers coming together and realizing that Christ already paid the price. He already paid it. And it's there for our taking to all who believe.
It's good. You know, one of the things I think we'd kind of be remiss too, without saying, if we didn't say it, is that Dad and our moms were able to serve the Lord so powerfully, and yet built such a family identity that the family wasn't lacking. We love being together. I mean, you can ask our spouses, they probably get a little tired of it, hearing the same stories over and over and stuff like that, but we just love the history that we've come from. Dad was like, he got along so well with the youth because I think he had a youthful heart. I still remember when I was little and not even in youth group, you guys going to Whitehorn Cove or going someplace. He was in the big fat middle of the youth retreats, you know? He loved it. He ate that stuff up. And when we get together, we know, hey, we're gonna have fun because that's what was cultivated in us, just this family identity of fun. And I think we've chosen our spouses, and the Lord chose our spouses for us accordingly, because they all, number one, can put up with it, number two, can have fun with us. So it was a lot of fun growing up. And then the people that we got to see and meet that we've already mentioned, Corey ten Boom, and it was such a missions-minded church, TCF was, that we had an influx of missionaries, and we got to hear about what God was doing around the world, and it just builds your faith, you know, and lights a fire in you to want to go and do the same, you know. It's almost like it's a Great Commission or something, you know.
Oh, this is my dad's necklace, and I just remember him wearing this in the 70s, I believe. Yeah, it's pretty groovy. And I just love seeing it and having it hanging where I can see it, and just a memory of my dad. He always wore a cross, and sometimes a big gaudy cross. Do you remember all the crosses he
Yeah.
had? But he always wore a cross, and I think just like David was saying earlier about that scripture, just a reminder, always a reminder in front of him of what God has done, and also a testimony, like, ask me about my cross.
I've got different eras here. This is my dad and my mom when they were married back in 1955, and Bill and Martha. And then this is a picture of my dad. I think that was during the time he was married to Ann. So, and then this Charisma magazine shows Ann and my dad. Ann was a widow with 3 grown children, and then, of course, my dad had 5 children of his own, and again, we all talk about how gracious Ann was. You can imagine with her 3 children and then stepping into pastor's wife role with 5 children. But this shows the blended families. Grandchildren were coming about that time as well. So I think they ended up with 32, 33 grandchildren. And
At that time, the grandparents, my dad's parents, were
yes,
still
Stella and Owen.
And my dad was quite a baseball player. So he played for Tulsa University.
He played second base,
Yeah.
and he actually was on the path to go pro, and that was his desire when the Lord called him to be a pastor.
This is a Bible that my dad first got when he was at Fern Creek Baptist in Fern Creek, Kentucky, outside of Louisville. And there's his signature, and there is none of self and all of thee. January 12, 1966. And of course, me being the oldest, I get to do the obits. Wait a minute. And this is my dad, and he passed away March 14, 2011.
Pie Day, that's appropriate. He loved pie.
Yeah. And on both him and my mother. My mother died young, 44 years old, August 26, 1977. But the biggest thing for both of these that all of us kids, I think, could say was what was big with my parents was faith, family, and their friends, you know, and of course Dad fishing. But
I've got a veritable potpourri of pictures here, but I want to start with my mother. She was gorgeous, and you can see that in this picture. And then Dad and Ann down here were really a dynamic couple. They were a lot of fun to be around as well. And then Dad and Gloria, in their own way, were extremely fun to be around because they both were so sharp and so witty that you kind of had to stay on your toes to be around them. And then, of course, there's all of us kids with Dad. We just loved being with him and being together. I don't even know how to say it. He made you feel so wanted and so accepted and just had fun with you. And then this, I'll go to this picture down here, is Dad doing one of the things that he loved is being with friends, but also fishing. And one of his best buddies was Chuck Farah. And that's in Colorado where they used to catch a lot of trout. And he and Chuck, we could tell you stories about them. So I can remember this one time when he and Chuck were fishing. It wasn't even in Colorado, it was in those ponds in Sapulpa. And Dad had a canoe at the time. And Chuck would sit in the front and Dad would be in the back working the trolling motor. And so Chuck hopped out, started pulling the canoe up the hill, not realizing that the canoe would tip over if you did it just wrong. And he did it just wrong. And Dad tipped over and fell in the water. But Dad loved fishing so much and loved Chuck so much that it really didn't deter him. I could tell you another story about times, well, probably multiple stories, about when Dad probably deserved that because of some of the things that he did to Chuck. But they had such a great relationship, it was fun to watch. And then we've got Granddad Sanders and Grandmother Sanders with a lot of their great grandkids. And we come from a line where we love kids. Dad loved to get down and play with the kids, and I can see that his parents loved the grandkids as well. So it's fun, and Tammy and I look forward to the day when we have grandkids too. But I have fun with all the kids, and have had fun with all the kids.
You take pictures of our dad, and he normally was holding one of the babies.
He loved babies.
One example of that's right there where he's having a tea party with the grandchildren.
Well, this is a picture of Tom Mahone. I guess he's in it. And Dad, there were a lot of pastors that were just, the Spirit was really moving on them. And they would come together. There was not competition. You know, we're on the same team. And we were meeting at a school, and they would baptize in the swimming pools at the schools. And it was just such a sweet time of rejoicing. I just remember after each one, people would just clap and praise the Lord.
And you know that Tom and Jean Griffin and Chuck Farah, who my dad was fishing with in that picture, would all meet out here on this porch or in our living room, depending on weather, and have breakfast. They'd meet once a week and have breakfast together. And I loved that community where pastors are getting together and sharing Jesus and asking questions and going deeper and even challenging each other. I remember eavesdropping on some of those.
you know, we have a godly heritage, and one of my earliest memories is at my parents' house, 1127 South Richmond. And every night before we went to bed, they would get on their knees in front of their chair and pray for my Uncle Ed, who was a Baptist missionary in Indonesia, and for my dad and his ministry at that time when I was little in Kentucky. And God hears a mother's prayers. And she prayed, Grandmother Sanders and Granddad Sanders on their knees, they prayed that their sons would lead many people to the Lord. And there's power in prayer.
Yes, this is a bulletin from my mom's service. But on her tombstone, Dad had written a gentle and quiet spirit. And that pretty much summed her up. She had such a heart for people. She wasn't out front at all. She was very private, but she was there for friends that were going through needs, and she was there for us, and just felt really blessed. Good, strong heritage.